This year's Group of 20 summit in South Africa came to close this past weekend with a leaders' declaration that was announced on the first day of the two-day multilateral meeting, despite an earlier unilateral advice against such a declaration by the US. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. You're watching this week's first edition of Press Perspective. It's Monday, November 24th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. One of the final multilateral leaders' meetings on the diplomatic stage for this year ended in South Africa this weekend, with the US noticeably absent. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, hope you had a great weekend.
I did, but happy to be here too.
I also have Chloe Borgnon with French broadcaster France 24. Chloe, welcome back.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Steven, we shall start with you. So this year's G20 summit in South Africa adopted a declaration on day one of the two-day multilateral meeting. First, perhaps we can touch upon some of the details of the declaration.
Well, the first detail I will point to is that it's unusual that that kind of thing comes out on the first day. Normally, like the way that these things go is they spend, whatever it is, the 2 or so days talking about this, and they try to agree on language, they try to agree on what to include and what to leave out. Perhaps there's a kind of particularly sensitive global affair of the moment that they might want to leave out because it will be hard to agree on the more kind of sensitive details of that. But if I had to sum up this gathering, it seems to be like what we could say about it is that it was a kind of demonstration of multilateralism and a kind of expression of the will to continue with this kind of thing. As you mentioned, Sunhee, the U.S. was notably absent, and the U.S. has I think the reason that President Trump gave in this particular case for declining to participate was he feels as though the South African government is kind of irresponsibly handling some dire conditions faced by white farmers in the country. I think the statistics don't quite back up his position. Like, it's a kind of contested narrative that he's presenting. But this is kind of in line with the way that Trump has behaved throughout his presidency. Just recently down in Gyeongju at the APEC gathering, he did arrive, but he just had his kind of bilateral meetings and attended a CEO summit, and then he left before the kind of main multilateral engagement part of the event. So, I mean, that's up to him, and he can do that. But it seems to me like if you read the comments, if you read this declaration, and if you read the comments coming out of this, it emphasizes things that seem particularly like not up Trump's alley. It says that like these leaders are committed to working together to face challenges faced by poorer countries, or global countries of the global south, or kind of less influential countries. Things like climate change, things like specifically how like climate change, the weather changes associated with climate change kind of disproportionately affect poorer countries, countries that rely more on agriculture or on resource extractions, who have larger populations, who are in informal housing, who are in houses that don't have reliable climate control inside of them. And another thing that they emphasized was managing the levels of debt that a lot of poorer countries are under. So I think the message that the organizers in South Africa and the participating nations seem to be intent on sending was that the global community is going to keep engaging in these types of multilateral settings, whether or not the U.S. wants to participate, and just kind of drive home the reality that like Trump and his team can decline to take parts in these kinds of things if they choose. That's up to them. But the party is going to go on without them. And the party is going to make alternative arrangements and maybe try to demonstrate to the U.S. that by declining to participate in these kinds of things, that they're maybe losing out on opportunities. They're losing out. There's a lot of foreign policy critics even within the United States who are now arguing that the U.S. is abdicating its traditional role as a major player in multilateral settings. And the U.S. is kind of inevitably going to see its global influence wane as a result. I mean, just to mention APEC again, when I was tasked with writing an analysis piece to sum up that gathering, the kind of emerging narrative was that by departing early, Trump had kind of ceded the floor to Xi Jinping and China and kind of allowed Xi to have a lot more control over how things went on and kind of seize opportunities that were created by, a kind of vacuum effect by the U.S. not being there, create space for more different countries to step in. And this seems like a continuation of that trend.
Right. So while the U.S. chose to be absent from this particular multilateral meeting, Chloe, it nonetheless advised South Africa against adopting a declaration given its absence. What do you believe are the broader implications of the adoption despite the U.S.'s advice against it?
Yeah, so as Steven was explaining, the US decided to boycott the event, so they were not there. Mostly, because of the clashes and the tensions that have been happening between the two countries, between South Africa and the United States, with Donald Trump, who has been claiming that South Africa is violently persecuting the country white African minority, which has been widely rejected by the by the leader of South Africa himself. And so the US said either not to take any decision or to take a toned-down one that would just be a way for South Africa to cap the summit, kind of saying you can still have a declaration but nothing big. What's interesting to see is that the United States are also going to be the head, like the host country of the next G20 summit, and they are going to take the head of the rotating presidency. So the fact that the countries decided, the participants still decided to adopt a joint declaration and make a declaration all together is interesting to see as a way of opposing quite frontally the US. As Steven was explaining, when you see the themes that were inside the declaration, it's also a way of saying that the rules and the multilateralism has to be respected, and that if the United States are not there, then decisions does not belong to them. The White House spokesperson said that South Africa refused to facilitate a smooth transmission in the G20 presidency, and she was unhappy with the fact that South Africa has pushed some of the issues that we were speaking about into this declaration. So they were saying at the White House, they were saying that it was actually a way for South Africa to weaponize, and I'm quoting them here, weaponize the G20 presidency to undermine the G20's funding principles. So we can see that the United States understood what was going on there, which is, as Steven was saying, there's kind of undermining their position and also saying that without them, with them being absent, all the people and all the players can also take some light and put some other aspect in the forefront, in the light.
Right, and staying with this, Steven, Canadian broadcaster CBC had earlier reported that Mr. Trump's absence from the G20 this time around might provide Prime Minister Mark Carney with the opportunity to engage in broader trade dialogue with his global counterparts. Would you say this was the case this past weekend?
I don't know if I can say that this was necessarily because Trump wasn't there or if he would have just held these meetings anyway, but it seems like that is something that Carney would say, at least, because his kind of political brand has become being, kind of an anti-Trump kind of, there's the emerging narrative that came out when he won the last election was that his party was in a really kind of weak position and that Canadian voters were in the mood for a change. I got to admit, I am no longer a Canadian voter. I haven't voted in a Canadian election in a very long time. But and then he got into power because he took this kind of forceful stance on Trump's tariffs, and he argued that this was a betrayal of the very long-standing relationship between the two sides. So he's continuing to act on that. I mean, I thought it was noteworthy that he held a meeting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and they pledged to possibly even double their bilateral trade to $70 billion by some point. And, I thought that was interesting because the Canadian-Indian relationship had gone through a very tumultuous period in the past few years. There were some disputes, some accusations going back and forth that we don't really have time to get into here. A lot of Canadian diplomats withdrew from India, so I think it's a positive sign that those two sides are re-engaging in a productive manner. Maybe that is because Modi and Carney are kind of reading the global tea leaves and are feeling like, due to the turmoil introduced by the United States and its tariffs, it makes more sense for them to cooperate. It kind of adds a sense of urgency. This is a theme that we see at these kind of multilateral engagements all the time now, that countries feeling like because they can rely less on the U.S., because there's this growing superpower conflict between the U.S. and China, it is this imperative now more than ever to seek new partners and to seek to deepen those partnerships that already exist. So Carney, I think, was quite eager to present the transpirings in South Africa as a kind of demonstration of the U.S. being, this being a kind of a less U.S.-centric world, that there are more influential actors who are finding new ways to cooperate with each other. I think the quote that he said was, "This is a reminder that the center of gravity in the global economy is shifting." That's a great soundbite, for folks like us who work in the media. That's a great quote. Time will tell just as, to what extent it proves to be true. The U.S. does still have the world's largest consumer market. The U.S. is still influential in a lot of ways. But Carney went on to talk about how those who were gathered in South Africa were going to increase their focus on sectors like artificial intelligence and energy and these kind of new and exciting and very quickly evolving areas of the global economy. So we will need a bit of time to see just how much the U.S. has missed out on and just how much that has created space for new opportunities. But of all the world leaders in South Africa, I think Carney was probably uniquely incentivized to send that message that there are new and productive things happening, whether or not the U.S. is there to be part of it.
Right. Also ahead of the G20 this past weekend, French radio news network RFI, Chloe, touched upon French President Emmanuel Macron's latest Africa agenda. What would you say have been some of his diplomatic gains?
Yeah, so French President Emmanuel Macron took the opportunity of the G20 to have a 5-day visit to African nations. So he went to Mauritius, to South Africa, where the G20 was happening, to Gabon and to Angola. What's interesting to see is that they are kind of not the most historical partners for France. That's because there's been an anti-French sentiment in the region that's been growing up quite a lot. France is not welcome in the Sahel region at the moment. There's also been recently the military coup in Madagascar that's also been raising the anti-French sentiment over there. So there's a kind of need for France on the African continent to kind of make a reorientation of the diplomatic forces to try to find new partnerships. That's what we can see there in the engagement that the President Emmanuel Macron had with other countries. So there was obviously some diplomatic ties, some cultural ideas, some people-to-people relationship developments that are going to happen. But what we can see that was probably the main point is the economic stakes. So there is an idea, that's what RFI was saying in their article, that the president is here to promote what they are calling, what the government is calling, the win-win partnerships that are aimed to support our countries from the African continent, while also helping French businesses and citizens. So that would be, for example, in the mining industries, offering to some of the countries who have mining resources the technological help from French companies and putting them together. That's a way for France also, as I was saying, to kind of try and shift and find new partnerships and develop new partnerships on the African continent at the moment.
Right, and speaking about partnerships, President Lee Jae-myung and French President Emmanuel Macron also sat down on the sidelines of the G20 summit in South Africa. What has been shared about their bilateral exchange?
So what we've heard for the moment is that they had the meeting on the 22nd on the sideline of the G20. First thing, obviously, was the invitation from President Lee Jae-myung to President Emmanuel Macron to come to South Korea next year, because the two countries are celebrating their 140th anniversary for the diplomatic relationship between the two countries. President Macron answered saying that he will try to come. So that's already a good thing. Let's see if this state visit can really happen or not, because we have to obviously see in the near future all the events are going on, what's going on. I know that obviously in Europe there's been quite a lot of trouble still now with the war in Ukraine or other events. So we'll see how it can go and if this state visit really happens anytime soon. They also discuss ways to strengthen cooperation in economy, security, advanced technology and culture, because that's also one of the important parts. I mean, the three main fields are we already know about, but culture is also a big thing because Korean culture and the Hallyu wave that we were speaking quite a lot here in the studio are reaching quite well in France, and I've been reporting quite a few times on some of the K events, and I know that French audience is kind of very big fan of the Korean culture, and the other way around can also be happening. So that's some of the main things that would be happening. Also interesting to note that Emmanuel Macron has been saying thank you to South Korea for their clear and consistent commitment to the international community, and he was speaking especially about the Russia-Ukraine war, because South Korea has been sending humanitarian help and trying to help in this way since the beginning of the war, and the President Emmanuel Macron has been thanking the country for that, which is interesting to note because it's not something that's mostly developed in the other bilateral meetings.
Right. Also on the margins of the G20 leaders meeting, Steven, the South Korean leader met with his counterparts from Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey and Australia under the so-called MICTA framework. Could you tell us a bit about this particular framework, its objectives and the discussions they had in South Africa?
In their discussions in South Africa, they talked about increasing cooperation with each other to address rising trade tensions and supply chain issues and other kinds of economic uncertainties. I think the kind of binding factor of these 5 countries is that they're all kind of mid-sized economies. Most of them are, like, there's quite a bit of difference in the way that each of these economies is oriented. You know, you have a kind of resource and tourism-based economy in Australia, an intensely export-led economy in South Korea, and you know the other 3 countries. It's not as though they have a ton in common. It's basically like the size of their economies that they have in common, and the fact that neither of them are in the kind of superpower league of the economy, and they're both kind of trying to balance economic and geopolitical relations with both the U.S. and China, and I think that kind of created an impetus for these 5 countries to try to come together and to see what they could do, try to maybe have a kind of preferential trade status or other kinds of advantageous relationships. But I don't know if that, like, I don't think there's like a specific, like, really binding agreement between them. It's not as though they have like a charter that they'll abide by in any kind of super strict sort of way. But I just, as we've been talking about, I think this is like another platform for a partnership that is gaining a kind of increased relevance with everything that's going on in the world.
Right. Chloe, as you mentioned earlier, the US will be hosting next year's G20 summit. What are perhaps some of the related stories that you are planning to keep your eye on?
Well, as correspondent from South Korea, I think that would be a good way to keep sideline stories about the United States and South Korea relationships. So I'm thinking right now we just had the APEC summit quite recently, so that would probably be one of the time to be taking on what has been promise over there. So that would probably be about the nuclear propulsion submarines story, see how it's developing. Other stories would be about microchips, US force in South Korea. I think that's mostly what could be covered for South Korean correspondent for foreign medias here. That would be the best way to do, would be also seeing, because I mean we still have a bit of time to see that, so will probably be another time to be speaking about President Lee Jae-myung's position regarding China, Japan, United States, because all of them are moving quite a lot at the moment. And who knows, maybe this time North Korea will also be in the equation, because let's remember that Donald Trump has said that he wants again to be discussing with Kim Jong-un. So maybe by next G20 summit that would have happened, and we'll see if there's stories to cover there as well.
Right. South Korea will be hosting the G20 summit in 2028. What has President Lee Jae-myung said with regard to this upcoming event? Yeah,
so he has said that he has made the promise to host it with a profound sense of responsibility. And what he was saying there is that according to him and South Korea, I mean, the G20 is a compass for international community in time of crisis. And as we know, the world is currently in a lot of crisis, so that he's saying that according to him it's important to consolidate the role of G20 as the forum for international economic cooperation. So that's once again, that's for the economical part and being able to meet with leaders regarding economy, but also the other important part is the international cooperation. So he's been urging member states to work together, for example, to build a stable and better supply chain for critical minerals regarding microchips, but also, being sure that all the countries have a way and a platform to be discussing together in time of crisis.
Right. Steven, President Lee Jae-myung is now in Turkey as we speak, actually. What can you tell us about his agenda there?
Well, this is a special relationship between these two countries, as whenever they get together, they like to talk about Turkey having participated in the Korean War, and there being a kind of a historical sense of brotherhood and cooperation. On this particular trip, I think Lee is going to be talking a lot about energy. His office has highlighted, he gave an interview to a Turkish media outlet at the outset of his trip where he talked a lot about cooperation in nuclear power, biohealth, digital transformation, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence, which, I mean, if you were to summarize Lee's meetings with the leaders of a lot of countries, he would probably be talking a lot about those things just because they're, kind of new and pressing matters. But I think behind the scenes of his Turkey trip, there will be a lot of talk about South Korea possibly becoming involved in Turkey's Sinop nuclear power plant. Lee has been, uncharacteristic for a left-wing president. Lee has, I think, been pretty positive on the question of nuclear matters. In his meeting with Trump, he got the U.S. to agree to approve South Korea's efforts to build nuclear-powered submarines, and South Korea has for a long time been seeking to increase its exports of nuclear expertise and to take on projects of building nuclear power plants overseas. So I think the nuclear industry and everyone connected to that is watching this visit quite closely.
Right, indeed. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this edition. Steven, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Chloe, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. We return same time tomorrow with a panel session on bilateral ties between South Korea and Turkey. Do join us then.